very general how he came to the project, how he discovered the writings of Nikolai Fedorov. Just briefly, just to give you a very, very broad frame, and then we'll move deeper and deeper into the subject.
Thank you, Maxa. Well, basically, I was always curious. Russia has a kind of a very sort of well-known literary history. There were all of these great novelists and playwrights like Tolstoy, Chekhov, Dostoevsky, but it doesn't appear to have a philosophical tradition, which always fascinated me, because actually, just from my upbringing or my background, I know that Russians are completely fascinated by philosophy. For example, Hegel is probably more popular in Russia than he ever was in Germany or in Western Europe. There is not like a kind of a philosophical movement that comes out of Russia in 19th century or 20th century and all of that. And then at a certain point, almost accidentally, I stumbled into this enormous tradition which is called Russian cosmism, which started in the middle of 19th century and was incredibly influential for quite a significant period of time until it virtually disappeared in the 1930s, because basically as Stalin came to power, all of this kind of kind of things other than a very particular interpretation of Marxism were not allowed. So most of the writers from this movement, most of the artists and scientists that participated in it either ended up in labor camps or in jails or were executed. The books were largely destroyed, taken out of circulation. So the entire kind of tradition or movement was suppressed and forgotten about until quite recently. So basically it vanished in sometime in 1932, and it doesn't really reappear until late 70s, let's say.
I have a feeling that this trilogy takes a little bit the shape of one of the main themes of the film, which is the sun. So the first film, lots and lots of landscape, almost like these rays of the sun, like a primordial soup, lots of nature, grass and water. The second film moves us a little bit closer into the circular form of the sun. Things become more concrete, more human faces, technology. And then the last film is almost like a central point for me, where you only move within the interior of several museums, but the discourse becomes very specific around resurrection and the museum. My question here is, how did you plan the trilogy? Did you set out within a certain system, or did you just make the first film and then you just played it by ear, kind of?
Well, it wasn't planned at all. I mean, all the films are very much a research project, and again, this is somewhat of an obscure, field. There are not very many experts on it. There is not very much published. It's not something that is taught in universities or colleges. There are, of course, a lot of primary texts, and if you look very carefully at history of Soviet avant-garde in art, or if you look at history of science, you actually realize that, oh my God, this is all over the place, or this particular sphere of thinking. But there is not like an authoritative text, there is not the book that sort of canonizes this topic. So basically it started from zero, so I kind of found out about this really interesting movement, but there was nothing really to film. I got a little bit of support from a museum in Moscow that wanted to commission a kind of a research project, so I proposed to them to make a film. But it was really kind of an ironic situation that we were, basically they wanted us to make a film, but we didn't know what to film, what should be in the picture. So we traveled throughout, the entire kind of geographical area of the former USSR, following footsteps of some of the main thinkers, some of the main sort of protagonists of this movement. So a lot of them spent quite a bit of time in Kazakhstan under very different circumstances. In the 19th century, some of the philosophers lived there because of the kind of almost mystical connection to this belief that the body of Adam is buried in the Himalayan mountains near Pamir, and Kazakhstan, the mountain range in Kazakhstan is the foothills of Himalaya. So a lot of them were going there to look for some kind of mysterious origin of human life, or of life on this planet. Later in 1940s, 1950s, Kazakhstan had the biggest sort of labor camp system, and a lot of artists and philosophers were basically imprisoned there. So there was a whole bunch of people from cosmist movement there for totally different reasons. So that is basically how we ended up there and why we were, and of course Kazakhstan is incredibly beautiful visually. It has this mountain ranges, but also steppes and kind of deserts and things like that. So it's very cinematic. It's very, very interesting to film there. And then the last film, you know, it's the one that's maybe the text is directly from the founder of this movement, which is this figure Nikolai Fedorov. He was a librarian all his life, and for him, museum is like the central institution in human society where the resurrection will take place. You know, because museums preserve everything, yeah. But he felt that preservation is insufficient, or what is the reason to preserve things if you're not going to bring them back to life, yeah? What is the reason to preserve the likeness of your ancestors if you're not going to use it in some way in the future when you have adequate technology to bring them back to the world? For him, it was all about forgetting the past and moving into the new, but it's a kind of like a continuation of a kind of, let's say, capitalist amnesia, where you constantly produce new merchandise, you want people to consume them, but all of that comes at the expense of forgetting or obliteration of the past. So he felt that the museum is kind of a unique institution in our society that is completely dedicated to the memory of the past, which is absolutely essential to his thinking, because you can't resurrect something that you don't remember. So the first act of resurrection is memory, and the museum is the place of memory.
I was thinking of the museum like as a cultural DNA, where you can go back to and reconnect to this culture that you carry inside of yourself, resurrect this tradition and this memory, and it really revived me. I'm actually I'm an art historian, so for me, really, this film really gave the museum back to me.
You could say that this is a kind of a prototype of a museological collection. So for Fedorov, like the two are very much linked, and then the third element would be something like an observatory, and kind of astronomy and astrology as a mnemonic device, because the only way to remember or to be conscious of the new movement of the universe, of the movement of our planet, is really to remember where the stars were the night before, you know. So, and it's quite interesting because humans have observed, you know, stars and planets for millennia, and there are quite concrete records. There are all sorts of, you know, recordings from ancient Egypt, from Mesopotamian cultures, from medieval Europe and Russia, from Mesoamerica. Everybody seems to have observed the sky and recorded quite meticulously the activity of the sun, the activity of various comets and, you know, solar body, terrestrial bodies and stuff like that. So that's actually, strangely enough, is one of the fields in which there is really abundant information, but from the entire planet, yeah, because everybody can see them. So for Fedorov, like basically he wanted the museum and the observatory to become one institution, yeah? And the act of looking up into the cosmos for him is identical to the act of looking at some kind of a museum artifact, yeah? In a vitrine or a painting on the wall. It's the same kind of process of observation, which for him was very, very important as it connects to memory, as it potentially connects to some future resurrection.
And I would like to ask you, so if you could identify kind of this philosophical root within cosmism, let alone the utopian aspect of it and, you know, the resurrection for all, this is a new philosophy, it's a new society. Do we find that root in the Orthodox Church, you know, in that wooden 17th century church?
So there are those two things. One is immortality and resurrection, and that which is biblical, I guess it comes out of Christianity. And the other one is a very kind of futuristic, which has to do with space travel, space colonization, and eventually becoming a kind of a universal race of beings that are immortal and, yeah, populate the entire universe. Yeah. The way it started, it seems like my latest, because you know, even though these films are finished, I'm continuing to work with this project, and maybe there will be other films on this, but I'm doing quite a lot of research into the origin of this thinking, because it is quite peculiar. And it seems that it all starts at the end of 18th century, in 1780s, when a comet was discovered, yeah, by a German astronomer. I believe his name was Werner von Biela or something. He was an aristocrat and a scientist. And he discovered a comet that appeared to be heading straight for our planet. Yeah. So around that time, there was basically kind of a panic in Europe, and eventually it became like a worldwide panic that this planet is going to be destroyed by a collision with a comet. Yeah. And it was expected to hit Earth in year 1830 or so. Yeah. So there is a lot of novels written about this. Actually, Mary Shelley. The first science fiction novel is apparently written by Mary Shelley, which is Frankenstein, but Frankenstein is not futuristic. After Frankenstein, she wrote another novel which is called The Last Man, which is basically a novel about the end of the world, and it was inspired by this comet. It also inspired a lot of writing in the Russian Empire. Some of it was normal fiction, some of it, but one of these novels was completely remarkable. It was perhaps the first futuristic science fiction novel ever written about that Earth is imminently about to be destroyed by a comet that's heading for it. And there is this Chinese man from Beijing who is traveling to St. Petersburg because he wants to meet Russian scientists who may have some kind of a special technology to prevent this disaster, to stop this comet or to divert it. Yeah, and he travels in these electric trains that move under Caspian Sea, and the novel is incredible. It describes basically 21st century. Everybody has a flying device. He kind of describes hot air balloons, but they're kind of personalized. So every household on the planet has their own hot air balloon. Everybody has a telegraph in their house, so everybody is connected and are communicating just like we do with internet. The newspapers are published on liquid crystal screens, yeah, which is incredible, like foresight into what we're actually looking at our computers, and so forth. And this person ended up becoming the director of the library where Fedorov later worked at all his life. Yeah. So there is a kind of a very strange, almost mystical connection between observation of this comet that was supposed to destroy our world, somebody writing a science fiction novel in response to that, and then a whole generation of philosophers, scientists, until we get to spaceflight and we have Sputnik and Gagarin and, you know, man on the moon and the whole thing. Yeah, but what is important about it is that it's not driven by technology, it's driven by ideas and imagination. Yeah? That it's driven by science fiction novels, it's driven by drawings and paintings and incredible capacity to imagine in a very powerful way some kind of a future. Yeah? Most people assume that development, technological development, is driven by some kind of data or, I don't know, some kind of a technical possibilities. Yeah, but as I'm researching this project, what is totally amazing, yeah, is that something as flippant as an unfinished novel can end up causing somebody to build a rocket that actually goes in space. Yeah. And this is really peculiar and very empowering for me as an artist because, you know, I'm not an engineer and I'm not a scientist and I don't know how to resurrect anybody or how to colonize Mars. But I can make films and I can sometimes write texts and, you know, and it's really interesting and very affirming to see that it's just as powerful as everything else.
Just briefly say something about the upcoming exhibition in Berlin at the House at Kulturnet, where you present this film as a world premiere for the installation version of it.
Yeah, I mean, in a way, like, these films were not really made so much for cinema, and I kind of understand how difficult it is to take in all three of them at the same time. They're really made for museums as kind of video installations, and the difference is very, very big, because usually video installation is something on a loop, yeah? So you could see it several times, because these are very, very dense, and it may not be possible to actually follow all of this text, all of these ideas on the first viewing, yeah? So, of course, maybe not everybody is interested in it, but the people who are interested in the museum situation could see it again as many times as they need to actually understand it completely, yeah? The first question, the answer is yes, of course. I mean, you know, cinema is just yet another mnemonic device, yeah, another way to remember, yeah? And I think basically it's all a part of the strange universal museum the temple of memory that Fedorov advocates here, or he wants to come into being. The other thing about my process is totally uninteresting. It's really boring. It's just like sitting home and reading or looking on Google for certain things. Yeah, there is nothing cinematic about it. There will be other films, but I think it will be something else. I think the next one will be a musical. Yeah, so yeah, on the same topic, but in a different form.